Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. We bring together the latest research in linguistics, language acquisition, and biblical studies to better understand the biblical languages and ultimately the biblical text. As always, this episode is brought to you by Biblingo, the premier solution for learning, maintaining, and enjoying the biblical languages. Visit biblingo.org to learn more and start your 10-day free trial.
This is your host, Kevin Grosso, and I'm excited to talk with Dr. Shaye Cohen today about the Oxford Annotated Mishnah. Welcome to the show, Shaye.
Nice to be here, Kevin. Thank you for inviting me.
So Shaye was just telling me that he is a semi-retired professor of Hebrew at Harvard. And I thought I would let him kind of introduce what exactly that means and what he does and what gets him excited in the scholarly world.
Okay, good. Nice to be here, Kevin. Thank you for inviting me. So my official title at Harvard is the Hancock Professor of Hebrew Literature and Philosophy, which is a fancy kind of funny title because when they came up with it in the 1920s, they didn't have the other lingo that we have. Nowadays, I would say I'm a professor of Jewish studies. I'm a professor of the history, development, change, laws, theology, philosophy, etc., of what we call Judaism. That's I think they didn't have that language yet in the 1920s, but we do have that language now. So I teach when I'm teaching. I'm not retired. I teach courses on the history of Judaism, the history of Jews, Jewish law, Jewish books, Jewish thought, and related matters. And since I am a member of a faculty of a non-denominational institution, I also do things on Christianity. I give classes on comparative Judaism and Christianity, Jewish reading of the Christian Bible, Christian reading of the Jewish Bible, history of biblical interpretation, things like that, because I enjoy it. I love the stuff. And that's one of the things that I do. I am, as you said, semi-retired. This term I'm on leave. Next term I'm on leave. And then come July 1st, 2025, I really am on leave because they expect me to clean out my office, which may be a problem, but I'm working on it.
Yeah, I know the difficulties of cleaning out your office, so that much I know.
So what I like to say is that, the Judaism is not something that I do, it's something that I am. Judaism, it's in my blood. I've been going to Jewish day schools ever since the kindergarten. In fact, I would say the first time I had a non-Jew as a classmate, I had already finished elementary school, finished high school, finished college, and it was in graduate school that I finally got to meet a Gentile, shake hands, and get to know people from the other side of the fence. I'm not joking. This is quite serious. That it took me a while to break out of my Jewish world and to get into the larger world, which I did in graduate school, because I had learned Greek and Latin and French and German, and we started to read all kinds of things. And we read Bultmann on the New Gospels. I mean, I did a lot of that kind of stuff. That's a product, though, of my graduate training.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And so now you're teaching classes on all kinds of things outside of, the Jewish world or inside of it, depending on your perspective on the
good
world.
point. Yeah, outside or inside. I got to think about that for a few minutes. Yeah, that's not so. It's not so simple.
We'll leave that question for another time. So we're here to talk about the Oxford Annotated Mishnah, and I was very excited when I saw this. Several people I know from Israel were contributors, professors, and such. So I just think it's an awesome thing to bring the Mishnah to life for the English-speaking world, and that's kind of what you say you want to do with the project. But in the acknowledgments, before we get to the introduction, or your introduction, it says that Shaye Cohen began this project, thinking he could translate and annotate the Mishnah single-handedly. When he realized that the completion of that task would exceed the divinely mandated limit of 120 years, he recruited two others to join him as editors, Robert Goldenberg and Chaim Lapin. So you couldn't do it in 120 years. Why did you want to translate and annotate the Mishnah to begin with? And what makes the task impossible for a single individual?
So here, this is volume 1, and I think Kevin has volume 1 also.
Yes, I do have my copy as well here. The
Oh,
the
there you
har-
go.
the
Okay.
not the hardback, because that would be I would be in
Uh,
debt from that.
That would be prohibitive, I
Yes.
think.
Yeah.
Okay, and the Mishnah takes up 3 volumes of this size, so we're close on to 2,500 pages. Well, it's 2,400 and change pages. Okay, so Kevin wanted to know what possessed me to try to translate the Mishnah. Well, I think I got inspired one time when one of those 1-volume Bibles just came out. I don't remember if it was the Jewish Study Bibles, which is just the Jewish part of the Bible, or whether it was the Oxford Annotated Bible, or it was the HarperCollins Study Bible, or the International something Bible, right? There are lots of these where for $30-something you get a 1-volume Bible. You get the whole Old Testament, pardon the expression. You get the whole New Testament, pardon the expression. You get the apocryphal books. No apology needed in that one. The apocryphal books. And then you usually get essays and maps and diagrams and charts and all kinds of other things, all for around 2,500 pages and all for around $30-something. And I remember thinking to myself when I got one of these landed on my foot and compelled me to pay attention to it, I looked at it, I said, what the world needs is not another 1-volume annotated Bible. The world has plenty of 1-volume annotated Bibles. What the world needs is an annotated Mishnah, because that there is none out there. Simply is none. Now we have 1-volume translation. I'm going to refer to this several times along the way, no doubt, by the late Reverend Herbert Danby. It's Danby. Herbert Danby was an Anglican professor who taught in Jerusalem when the British were in charge of Jerusalem. He was at St. George's Cathedral in Jerusalem. He served as canon, whatever that means exactly, I don't know, but he was the canon of the cathedral. And he was what we call a Christian Hebraist. He was a Christian, clearly, and a pious one too, as far as I could see, a believing Christian, but he was a Christian who was a Hebraist. He made his money by translating Hebrew into English, and he was very good at it. I have nothing bad to say about Herbert Danby or the work that Herbert Danby did. He did a very good job. He spent his whole career translating from the Hebrew, i.e. Jewish texts, into English. So that's Herbert Danby. It came out in the 1930s. It was a 1-volume translation done by one guy, Herbert Danby, who, as far as I could see, just sat in his office all day and just translated from Hebrew into English. And he did, I said, a very good job. Now, it's true you can find mistakes in his translation here and there. Okay, fine. I know that nothing's perfect. But you know what, Shaye? Before you start criticizing Herbert Danby, look at your own, right? And is your work a product of perfection? No, there are various issues too. I'll come back to my translation also. But what sets my work from Danby is not so much that one is better than the other. As I say again, I think Danby did a great job. And in many respects, the English translation of the Mishnah, the vocabulary, comes from Danby. They are the ones who gave us, like the King James Version, gives us the English. So Herbert Danby gives us English for the Mishnah. Before him, you have a tractate here was translated, a tractate there was by so-and-so and by so-and-so. So, Shaye, since Herbert Danby, as you just said, did the whole thing himself, and he did a very good job at it too, what on earth possessed you to try to take on the entire Mishnah by yourself, thinking you would compete with Herbert Danby? And what happened? I'm tempted to say Herbert won, is what I'm tempted to say.
I wasn't going to say it.
And in some respects, Herbert did win, and because he did do the whole thing in 1 volume. Therefore, it's much cheaper than the Oxford version.
So what makes this translation?
So what makes it? So why did the
Yeah.
world? What possessed Shaye that on that fateful day when he opened up the Oxford Annotated Bible, and all of a sudden it occurred to him the world needs the new translation of the Mishnah? The answer is Herbert Danby's translation is just a bare translation, 900 and something pages, with small print, very hard to read because the English is packed onto the page. There's very little white space on the page. So it's very, very hard to read. Not only does Herbert Danby make it harder to read because it's such small print, there are very few annotations, very few footnotes. Each tractate has a short introduction, very short, too short to be really helpful in my opinion, right? And he has occasional footnotes scattered throughout the text, and occasional footnotes to give a biblical reference or to explain what the technical term might mean. And all that is perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with any of that. In fact, I would say he did a very good job because Herbert Danby was very competent at what he was doing. But he does not make life easier for the reader. The text is already, to begin with, a very dense, very difficult, almost impenetrable text. And then on top of that, you put small, squiggly print packed onto the page with very, very few margins, and with occasionally a footnote every so often to explain what's going on. You don't make any life easier for the reader. And anybody who's using Danby's translation will tell you the English is difficult, the translation is difficult, the footnotes are few and far between, the margins are very narrow. When you put it all together, Danby does not do that which you would think he would do, which is try to make his text accessible to outsiders. He himself is an outsider. He's Anglican. He's completely competent to what he was doing. But at the end of the day, Herbert Danby's translation, I think, is unworkable. And I say that from teaching adult education to grown-ups, for teaching college, university, giving lectures, right? You give people a photocopy of a page of Danby and say, here, have a look at this and let's discuss it. Kevin, would you agree the text is very difficult?
The Mishnah text?
Yes.
The Hebrew text? Yes.
The English text is not much easier. Yeah.
Yes.
So that's when the bright light went on, the light bulb went on, and I said, what the world needs is not just another translation of the Mishnah. What the world needs is an annotated translation of the Mishnah. Now, I don't want a commentary. Commentary is easy. Go to your New Testament library, and I'm sure they have a section there on all kinds of books that have commentaries. The problem with a commentary is once the commentator gets going, usually there's no way to catch him. I mean, the thing goes on and on and on. It's endlessly repetitive. And the poor reader who's just trying to understand what on earth is going on in this mysterious text, it really is, I think, is overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
It's just plain overwhelmed. So that's my objection to most of these commentaries out there. They're too long. They're too detailed. They make no concessions to the reader. I wanted a translation that would make concessions to the reader. Now, there's a problem here. The Mishnah itself is extremely difficult, right? I can make all the concessions in the world, and I'm still stuck with an extremely dense, extremely difficult, extremely technical text. How am I going to make that available or accessible, open to outsiders? So the answer I came up with, I don't want a commentary. A commentary will go on endlessly. I don't want multiple volumes. So I proposed to Oxford. I wanted a one-volume Mishnah, just like the one-volume Oxford Annotated Bible. There should be a one-volume Mishnah. And I would say, here, you see this big fat volume? So I could get the whole Mishnah into one volume, I told Oxford. Give me 2,500 pages, and I'll get you the Mishnah to fit into one volume. Danby is 900 pages with very few annotations. Give me enough space for annotation, not a commentary. I don't want to do a commentary. I don't want to do 5,000 pages, right? I want something circa 2,500 pages, like an Oxford Annotated Bible, or like the HarperCollins Study Bible, like many of those other Bibles out there. We should be able to pull it off, I said. And the annotation will not be a commentary, so I save up a lot of room that way. Printed nicely on the page, unlike Danby, who gets ruined trying to get through his small print packed into a large page. Give me a little bit of room, and I can do it in 2,500 pages. That was my proposal. I said I want to do it in one volume, which I did not get. I want to do it on a very thin Bible paper, so we could do it in one volume. I didn't get that either, right? And we want but annotated text. That I did get, and that Oxford did a beautiful job. The page is very nice and is, from point of view of typography, accessible to people because it's inviting. There's enough white space on the page. You have the text above, annotations below, occasional footnotes in between. They gave me 3 lovely volumes, around 2,500 pages total. Beautiful print. They know what they're doing. They've been doing this since 1542 or whatever it is, since 15 something. So they know how to do this. So here it is, Oxford University Press, the Oxford Annotated Mishnah. So here I'm just going to open it up. So we have the main body of the text, which I chopped up into small lines, as if it were poetry. So the eye can rest between one line and the next, and the brain can rest between one line and the next. Unlike the usual annotated Bibles out there, which run from one margin to the other, and actually make it harder to read. So here we shorten the text so that we have shorter thought units. I try to come up with thought units so that each thought unit gets half a line or something like that. We have footnotes in the middle for technical details, various manuscript readings, alternative translations, problematic passages, and such. And then below are the annotations, which are down here. And so on, so this goes. So let's say it's Tractate Trumot. Now, if you notice, Trumot is not a very good English translation of Trumot. So the name of this tractate, there are 63 tractates in the Mishnah. So the name of this tractate is Tractate Trumot, and the English translation that Shaye Cohen and his friends give you is Trumot. Now, that's not very helpful translation, is it, Professor? No, I would say that's not one of our best translations. But I'll tell you this, though, it's better than Herbert Danby. Because Herbert Danby, when he came across a word like Trumot, which is obviously a technical term, he often translated it, but in such a way that the translation is no help whatsoever. What is Truma? Truma is a priestly gift. It's an offering from the Israelite farmer to members of the priestly establishment, either Levites or priests. Now, how are you going to translate Truma into English? So Shaye Cohen and his friends looked at that for a while and said, you know what? I can't translate Truma. There's no way I can possibly translate it with 1 or 2 word translation of Truma and get it to mean anything. So we're going to keep it as Truma, or in the case of Tractate Trumot, the plural, Trumot. Now, Herbert Danby looked at it and decided, well, Truma is a difficult Hebrew word, but we could translate it into English, and people will recognize what the English word means once they get used to it. And he came up with heave offering, which is a beautiful translation. It really captures the Hebrew meaning very well, with one small problem. Heave offering makes absolutely no sense in English. I challenge anybody who does not know what heave offering is from before. Are they going to open it up? Oh, heave offering. Yeah, sure. Heave offering. No problem. No sweat. Is that going to happen? The answer, of course, is no. Heave offering is completely incomprehensible as a translation. It doesn't help. Now, the way I compensated for this is that we have a glossary in the back. Joseph Danby has a glossary. So he will translate some of these technical terms for you. He has footnotes, which he occasionally uses for things like this. Most of the time, he doesn't use things like this for this purpose. So what do? I and my 2 friends and colleagues, we decided to leave Truma as Truma. We're going to annotate it the first time it appears in some detail. In the introduction to each tractate, we're going to explain again what Truma is. Yet again, we're going to have a glossary in the back of technical terms. Surely somewhere, the curious reader will figure out what Truma is. But I can't translate it because I don't have the English. There's no English vocabulary for Truma. That's a very good example of the different philosophies of Danby decided he was going to make up a translation, and Shaye decided we're going to keep it as an obscure term. Well, it's obscure in English, it's obscure in Hebrew, it's just obscure, and we're going to have to explain it. That's part of our job as translators.
Yeah, so that kind of gives us an idea of some of the challenges, right, of translating the Mishnah, all the technical terms. What other issues are there? You said before, the Mishnah is just hard. And honestly, it's hard whether you know Hebrew or not, right? I mean, there's certain, Hebrew will get you
Yes.
something, but it doesn't, explain all of the technical terms to you, or it doesn't tell you what they're talking about when you start reading the text.
Kevin, so Jim interrupting, but I'm going to
Yeah.
interrupt you anyway because this is your show, so you talk every week. So, right, I don't have that luxury. So here's the $1 million question.
Yeah.
Who writes and for whom is such a text written? Is the author of the Mishnah trying to be accessible? Is he trying to draw you in to his world so he could show you its beauty and its architecture and its meaning and its theology and its philosophy? Is that what the author of the Mishnah is interested in doing, i.e. to draw people in? I would say no. In fact, it's the opposite. It's as if the author of this text or the editor of this text is trying hard to keep riffraff out. Like pearls before swine. I don't want them entering the. If you don't know your way around here, or as we say in Boston, if you don't know where you are, you don't belong here. Right? That's the old phrase about driving in Boston. Right? If you can't find your way around, then you don't belong here, obviously. So similarly, the text is packed with technical terms, compressed speech, difficult grammar, and somehow the author of this text has the chutzpah, the effrontery to say, Well, this is a text that clearly people are going to want to study for the next couple of millennia, right? And it's going to be the foundation stone of rabbinic Judaism, right? That's this kind of text this is, right? Yeah, the kind of text that everybody's going to love reading, right? The text that any Israeli school child can pick up and read and understand what's going on, right? No, it's just the opposite. The text is, as it were, written in such a way so as to people who don't have expertise, well, you don't belong here. So whom is he writing this for? Footnote, not sure writing is the right word. It probably was oral. So whom was this text for? It's difficult enough if it's a written text, but to imagine this text functioning as an oral text is unbelievable. Now, what does that mean it's an oral text? What we mean is that the Mishnah embodies traditions that go back for centuries. Nobody is going to say that the editor of the Mishnah, whoever he was, sat in a drafty garret overlooking the Seine and composed the Mishnah. No, he didn't compose the Mishnah. He compiled the Mishnah. He edited the Mishnah. He's taking the Mishnaic traditions and turning it into a standardized anthology of text. Now, to imagine this taking place in writing is difficult enough. As I said before, we have 2,400 pages in English, more or less. And that's with lots of footnotes and with lots of annotations and so on. But it's a pretty substantial text. To imagine that people studying it in writing, but to imagine that this is an oral text, that the thing was never written down until centuries after its composition, that's just unbelievable. Now, the fact is, I know, or I knew in some cases, I knew people who did know the whole thing by heart. It's a great story about the late Professor Saul Lieberman, who was perhaps the greatest Talmudist of the 20th century, where you have a friend walk with him along Riverside Drive in Manhattan, near the Jewish Theological Seminary where I went to school. He'd walk up and down Riverside Drive with a companion next to him holding open the book. And Professor Lieberman would just recite one page after another, just because he knew it all by heart. So he was kept sharp by reviewing the text. So that's even more unbelievable. I'm in awe of such people. I can handle myself pretty well, I think, around the Mishnah, but this is just of a different league entirely.
For sure. Yeah. So you've talked a little bit about, sort of your translation philosophy. You will not translate the technical terms and then you'll explain it in a footnote. I thought it would be interesting to kind of compare your translation to some of the other translations we have available. So, you translated Mishnah Shabbat, and it opens with this line that is, I think you mentioned this.
It's such a stunner. I hope your audience is sitting down and ready for this. This is a stunner opening line. I cannot imagine what's called in the publishing business, a grabber, right? It grabs the reader and it doesn't let go. Kevin, why don't you read it for us?
Yeah, so it's Yetziot HaShabbat Shtaim Shehen Arba Bifnim Ushtaim Shehen Arba Bachutz.
Okay,
and so
got that?
So yeah, so exactly. So if you know Hebrew, you are still very confused, right? So your translation, the different types of prohibited transport on the Sabbath are two.
Excuse me a second, Kevin. Start again. This time read it slower with more feeling.
Okay. The different types of prohibited transport on the Sabbath are two, which are four for one who is inside, and two, which are four for one who is outside. So that's your translation.
Yeah, okay. I think it's a brilliant, beautiful translation. What do you think of it, Kevin?
I have no idea. what that. So like if you were to say that in English again, right? I mean, it's like your example with the heave offering. I wouldn't know what you meant, right? And so it'd have to be explained to me if I just saw that in English. Well, what does that actually mean, right?
It looks like English, but it's not English because it's,
right.
It's some mysterious dialect from some spaceship from Mars that landed here and talks this way.
Yes. And so there's Danby's translation is pretty similar. There are two, which are indeed four kinds of going out on the Sabbath for him that is inside, and two, which are indeed four for him that is outside. And each of you has, notes. And then I did find this one on Sepharia. This is from William Davidson.
Yes.
The acts of carrying out from a public domain into a private domain or vice versa, which are prohibited on Shabbat, are primarily two basic actions that comprise four cases from the perspective of a person inside a private domain. And
Well, that's
two
much
basic
better. That's much better, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, I read that. I was like, wow, this if the whole Mishnah was like this, you would understand it, right? There would be no problem. So I guess one of my questions is, you have that translation from William Davidson, which is on Safaria, and but you are choosing to translate more, like quote unquote literally, and then you are annotating that. So why did you choose that? And what does the reader gain, with your translation versus some of these others?
That's an excellent question. I'm not sure I can answer it properly, or I'm not sure I agree with myself anymore. It's been several years since I worked on this text. The key difference, I think, between my translation and that one is not that mine's good and that one is bad. Heaven forbid, I will not say such a thing. It simply is the fact that what's your theory of translation, as you correctly asked. I thought once we have the idea we are going to have annotations on the text, that both frees up the translator to be more literal than it otherwise might be, because he can always direct the reader to an annotation. And it also gives the translator more opportunity to explain what's going on. So I can do a beautiful translation, but if the reader can't make sense out of it, it doesn't work very well, does it? I haven't accomplished my goal. Because my goal is to make the Mishnah accessible, and that was our mantra, the three of us, when we worked on this together. Right? The goal is to make the Mishnah accessible to people to whom it otherwise is inaccessible. People who don't have Hebrew, people who don't have substantial years of training, as I had. I've been studying Mishnah since, I think, the fourth grade, maybe the fifth grade. So the annotation allows me to make the translation more literal, because I can always fill out the gaps. The logical gaps, I can fill them in with the annotation. The difficult part is, though, I need to be very careful with my annotations. I need to really control them, because otherwise they'll become like a commentary and explode, and then they'll take over everything. And you see that in Tractate Shabbat, the first one that I did. My introduction to Tractate Shabbat is excellent, but way too long, way too long. I hadn't figured out yet that you can't do that. It's just too much. It's not going to make the text accessible. It's going to overwhelm the reader. If it overwhelms the reader, then you haven't accomplished what you set out to do, which is to make the text more accessible. Anyway, but you see, that's the tension. That's the tension. Can you leave the text incomprehensible with annotations? Will that work or not? When I concluded this project, I thought, well, we have a pattern. We have an obscure, cryptic, mysterious text above, and we have annotations below, and the annotations will help the reader get through that mysterious text. The text is incomprehensible, but it's beautiful in its own mysterious, cryptic way. This is a beautiful text.
So would you do it differently now? Like, would you do a translation, that's similar to the one we see in Safaria, where you are, making it in plain English, right? So, Yetziot HaShabbat Shteim Shehen Arba Bifnim. I mean, that phrase in and of itself assumes so much, right? It
That's right.
assumes things that, even if I know Hebrew, right? I hear that and I would say, what's Yetziot HaShabbat? What does that mean? Why is there a Yetziot Shabbat, right? I mean, what is that? And so in William Davidson's translation, again from Safaria, the acts of carrying out from a public domain into a private domain, or vice versa, right? That is a very long translation
So,
of
Kevin,
two words.
you understand what that is? A public domain and a private domain?
In
Yeah, but
English, or in Mishnaic law?
yes. I mean, Davidson is translating it for you. He uses the phrase public domain and private domain. And
Right.
I would suggest that most people are reading it, see the words public domain, and they say, what? What on earth is public domain? And what's the private domain? And what
Right.
does it mean there are two which are four? I don't know. If
Right.
it's two, it's two. If it's four, it's four. What does it mean, two which are four? So you haven't finished the first sentence yet, and you're already completely lost.
So looking back, would you do your translation differently with less annotations and more in the text? Or do you feel like this, sort of split where you have more annotations and more of a literal translation is the best for the reader?
Yeah, I'm not sure the answer to that question, except that this I do know. I would make more of an effort to consistently draw annotations to the text from New Testament and from Christian texts. Because I think that's an audience that is not well served by anybody. And we did some of that. If you look at the footnotes, my annotations, we occasionally quote New Testament or Josephus or Philo or something, but we could have done a lot more of it, and we should have done it consistently. I think that would have been a good idea. That's not an audience that's well served otherwise. So the Jewish translators don't really care about the New Testament as an accessory to the Mishnah, right? But we do. We did, and we do. But I think we should have done that more. That's one thing I know for sure, where if I had time, but the Holy One, blessed be He, is not going to give me enough time for this. If I had more time, I would go back over it and say, well, let's go back in and get in all those references to Paul, right? Not just one passage here from Galatians, but let's get a bunch of passages and see how they stack up against the Mishnah. As for the rest, on this larger problem of short annotations, long annotations, and no annotations, which way makes the text most accessible? I'm not sure the answer to that. And I don't know if we succeeded as well as we might have. I think we did succeed. I think the text does have, for serious readers who are willing to invest energy with the annotations, they will get some help, which they don't get from Danby, and they don't get from other one-volume translations out there. But I don't know. What do you think, Kevin?
Yeah, it's a hard problem. I mean, it's
It's a hard text.
yes, but it's hard to. One of the things you said in your introduction was, we're trying to make this accessible for the Hebrew list reader. And as I
Right.
thought more about that, I thought, I can read the words on the page in Hebrew, but without knowing the rabbinic mindset and the rabbinic world, it's still very hard to make sense of what's going on. And so I
disagree. It's impossible to make sense.
So what I found very helpful, in working through some of the text, I haven't gotten through all 3 volumes yet, but is the introduction to situate you, to what's going on in this tractate, and again, the annotations, you open up the, Mishnah Shabbat, and you have to read the annotation, the footnote in the first line to make sense of it, right? And so I think those are really helpful. I think for, if I were to say, my grandma, right? If I say, hey, here's the Mishnah. This is a really interesting, Jewish writing, ancient Jewish text. Can you sit down and read it? Like, this is still inaccessible, right? But I read this one from, Will and Davidson from Safaria, and there's definitely things that she wouldn't understand, but she would understand the words on the page at least. The acts of carrying out from a public domain to a private domain, or vice versa. She would wonder, like, what is a public domain, what's a private domain, that kind of thing. So I think my perspective is what this volume really accomplishes well is people like me, right? People without that background who are interested in it from a scholarly perspective, and who with a little bit of digging, right, can make sense of it in a new way. I mean, I know, I've lived in Israel for 5 years, but it still just felt like this world is just opaque, and it's very, very hard to break into if you're not already in it. And so I think someone like me is the kind of person who would really benefit from this kind of volume. I mean, I think if you had, I would have really liked your annotations to include more Second Temple Jewish texts, New Testament or otherwise. But there's, obviously you're breaching on the edge of commentary there. But I think as it stands, these volumes are really helpful for people that are serious about the text but don't really understand, what's going on by themselves.
I just have one message for your Christian audience, right?
Yeah.
Christians, when they hear about the Mishnah, they assume that you could take the Mishnah text and set beside it Augustine. As I say, you have Augustine over here and the Mishnah over there, and you see the contrast between Judaism and Christianity. Here is Augustine doing his faith stuff, and here are the rabbis doing all their law stuff. And you can see the two texts sort of line up against each other. To which my response is, well, yeah, that's kind of true, sort of. But let's be really honest, ladies and gentlemen. The Mishnah text is far more incomprehensible to the reader than is Augustine. Augustine, you can read in translation without heavy-duty annotations. Just, on the bottom of the paragraph, they'll give you references to Paul and to Revelation and Acts and Pelagius and whatever. But in the case of the Mishnah, without these annotations, you're going to sink or swim, because the text is just plain difficult. And I said before, I love this text. I've been working with this text since the 4th grade, and I think it is a good entry point into rabbinic law. Whether it's a good entry point into rabbinic Judaism, that we can discuss. But it is certainly an entree into the world of rabbinic law. That it is, and the Mishnah, I think, should have some interest even for Christian readers, not just Jewish ones.
No, absolutely. And honestly, it is a fascinating text, even just historically, right? I mean, if you can understand it, right? That is the big if. So I just appreciate you coming on. Like I said, this is obviously a very monumental project in many ways, at least the size, and many scholars after you will benefit. So for that, thank you.
Thank you for your kind words.
So that's all we have time for on this episode of the Biblical Languages Podcast. Thank you, Shaye, for joining us.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review. You can also follow Biblingo on social media to discuss the episode with us and other listeners. And don't forget to visit biblingo.org to start your 10-day free trial of Biblingo.